The snow had ceased, but it caked the ground on Terminus deeply now, and the sleek ground car advanced through the deserted streets with lumbering effort. The murky gray light of incipient dawn was cold, and even in the then turbulent state of the Foundation's politics, no one, whether actionist or pro-Hardin, would begin street activity that early. Johann Lee did not like that. He worried that people were going to say that Hardin sneaked away. "Let them say it if they wish," said Hardin. "I've got to get to Anacreon, and I want to do it without trouble." "Listen to me carefully," said Hardin. 30 years ago, the time vault opened, and on the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Foundation, there appeared a Harry Seldon recording to give us our first idea of what was really going on. Lee recalled that it was the day they had taken over the government. "That's right," said Hardin. "It was the time of our first major crisis. This is our second, and 3 weeks from today will be the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the Foundation. Does that strike you as in any way significant?" "You mean he's coming again?" Lee asked. The mayor observed that Seldon had always done his best to keep all foreknowledge from them. "I've been there every anniversary since the first appearance," said Hardin. "He's never shown up, but this is the first time since then that there's really been a crisis." However, the point was that at today's session, Hardin wanted Lee to announce that he had left for Anacreon, and to further announce officially that on March 14th next there would be another Harry Seldon recording containing a message of the utmost importance regarding the recent, successfully concluded crisis. The mayor did not care whether the announcement was believed or not. All he wanted to do was confuse them, so that they would decide to postpone action till after March 14th. "I'll be back considerably before then," said the mayor. Now Hardin stamped through the snow toward the waiting spaceship that bulked somberly in the dimness, and at the open airlock turned about with outstretched hand. "Goodbye, Lee," he said. "I hate to leave you in the frying pan like this, but there's not another I can trust. Now please keep out of the fire." Salvor Hardin did not travel immediately to the planet Anacreon, from which planet the kingdom derived its name. It was only on the day before the coronation that he arrived, after having made flying visits to 8 of the large stellar systems of the kingdom. The trip left him with an oppressive realization of the vastness of the kingdom. When he did arrive at the capital world, it was to find all normal business at an absolute standstill. Every single person was taking feverish part in the hectic religious pageantry that heralded the coming of age of their god-king Leopold. In the palace's glittering, crowded ballroom, he had been introduced to Leopold, and from a safe distance, for the king stood apart in lonely and impressive grandeur, surrounded by his deadly blaze of radioactive aura. And in less than an hour, the same king would take his seat upon the massive throne of rhodium-iridium alloy with jewel-set gold chasings. Then, throne and all, would rise majestically into the air, skim the ground slowly to hover before the great window from which the great crowds of common folk could see their king and shout themselves into near apoplexy. The throne would not have been so massive, of course, had it not had a shielded nuclear motor built into it. Hardin fidgeted and stood on his toes to better his view, and then he saw Wienis threading through the crowd toward him. Wienis' smile crooked itself into a smirk as he invited the mayor to step into his private chambers where they could speak with considerably more privacy. In Wienis' chambers, Hardin relaxed in perfect comfort and accepted with a murmur of gratitude the glass of liquor that had been poured out by the regent's own hand. Hardin lifted his glass. "To Leopold first, king of Anacreon." They drank, and Wienis added blandly, "and soon to be emperor of the periphery, and further, who knows? The galaxy may someday be reunited by Anacreon," he said, "for with the help of the Foundation, Our scientific superiority over the rest of the periphery will be undisputable. Hardin set his empty glass down and replied, "Except that the Foundation is bound to help any nation that requests scientific aid of it, and we are unable to play favorites." Wiener's smile broadened. He quite understood that left to itself, the Foundation would never cooperate. Hardin pointed out that they had repaired the Imperial cruiser. "Yes," said Wienis, "but you would not have repaired it had I not threatened war." The mayor wanted to know if that threat still stood. "Now it is rather too late to speak of threats," answered Wienis. He cast a rapid glance at the clock on his desk, then turned to Hardin. "You are what they call a man of peace, aren't you?" he asked. "I suppose I am," said Hardin. "At least I consider violence an uneconomical way of attaining an end." "Not everyone," said Wienis, "is as afraid of direct action as you are. Your policy of peace, you see, has led you into making several serious mistakes." Wienis enumerated them. Hardin had come to Anacreon alone, and he had accompanied Wienis to his chambers alone. Outside the room, said the regent, are 5 police guards, well armed and ready to shoot. Then Wienis informed the mayor that he had made an even more serious error, that of leaving Terminus almost wholly undefended. "And while remaining helpless," said Wienis, "you kindly helped us to arm ourselves, aiding us particularly in the development of a navy of our own, a great navy, a navy which, since your donation of the Imperial cruiser, is quite irresistible." Hardin made as if to rise from his seat. "If you mean to declare war," he said, "you will allow me to communicate with my government at once." "When the war is fought," said Wienis, "not declared, Hardin, fought. The Foundation will be informed of it in due time by the nuclear blasts of the Anacreonian Navy under the lead of my own son upon the flagship Wienis, once a cruiser of the Imperial Navy." Hardin frowned. He wanted to know when this would happen. "If you're really interested," said Wienis, "the ships of the fleet left Anacreon exactly 50 minutes ago at 11, and the first shot will be fired as soon as they sight Terminus, which should be at noon tomorrow. You may consider yourself a prisoner of war." That, Hardin said, was exactly what he did consider himself. But, he added, he was disappointed, for he thought the moment of coronation, midnight, to be the logical time to set the fleet in motion. "Don't you understand?" he said to the perplexed Wienis. "I had set my counterstroke for midnight." Wienis started from his chair in disbelief. "If you don't understand," said the mayor, "I might explain that every priest in Anacreon is going on strike unless I countermand the order." He leaned forward and added with sudden animation, "Do you realize, Your Highness, that an attack on the Foundation is nothing short of sacrilege of the highest order?" Wienis was groping visibly for self-control. "Give me none of that, Hardin. Save it for the mob," he said. "My dear Wienis, whoever do you think I am saving it for?" said Hardin. He explained that for the last half hour every temple on Anacreon had been the center of a mob, listening to a priest exhorting them upon that very subject. There's not a man or woman on Anacreon that doesn't know that their government has launched a vicious, unprovoked attack upon the center of their religion. Wienis, suddenly furious, rushed out of the room. A hush had fallen over the elite in the ballroom as a broad path was cleared for the throne. Leopold sat on it now. Wienis paused on the stairway. No one saw him. All eyes were on the throne. He clenched his fists. Hardin would not bluff him into action. And then the throne stirred. Noiselessly it lifted upward and drifted. At the sound of the deep-toned bell that signified midnight, it stopped before the window, and the king's aura died. For a frozen split second, the king did not move, face twisted in surprise, without an aura, merely human. And then the throne wobbled and dropped to the floor with a crashing thump just as every light in the place went out. Through the shrieking din and confusion, Wiener's bull voice sounded, "Get the flares! Get the flares!" Back to the ballroom, guardsmen swarmed with torches, blue, green, and red, where the strange light lit up frightened, confused faces. Wiener shouted, urging the people to keep their places, that power would return in a moment. A guard then approached him to tell him that the palace was surrounded by people of the city. A priest was at the head of the mob. He had been identified as High Priest Verisov. He demanded the immediate release of Mayor Salvor Hardin and cessation of the war against the Foundation. Wiener cried, "If any of the rabble attempt to pass the palace gates, blast them out of existence." The torches had been distributed now, and the ballroom was again alight. Wiener rushed to the throne, still standing by the window, and dragged the stricken, wax-faced Leopold to his feet. "Come with me," he said. He cast one look out the window. The city was pitch black. From below there were the hoarse, confused cries of the mob. He swore angrily and dragged the king away. Wiener burst into his chambers, the 5 guardsmen at his heels. Leopold followed, wide-eyed, scared speechless. "Hardin," said Wiener, "you are playing with forces too great for you. I demand that you order the priests back to their jobs." Hardin looked up coolly. "Right now," he said, "there's not a wheel turning in Anacreon. There's not a light burning, except in the temples. There's not a drop of water running, except in the temples. On the wintry half of the planet, there's not a calorie of heat, except in the temples. The power plants have shut down. All ships are grounded. If you don't like it, Wiener, you can order the priests back to their jobs. I don't wish to." Wiener stated firmly that his forces could hold out. "We'll last the day," he said. "And when the news comes back that the Foundation has been taken, your precious mob will find upon what vacuum their religion has been built, and they'll desert your priests and turn against them. I give you until noon tomorrow, Hardin, because you can stop the power on Anacreon, but you can't stop my fleet. They're on their way, with a great cruiser you yourself ordered repaired at the head." Hardin replied lightly, "Yes, the cruiser I myself ordered repaired, but in my own way." Theo Apparat was one of the very highest-ranking priests of Anacreon. From the standpoint of precedence alone, he deserved his appointment as head priest attendant upon the flagship Wiener. But it was not only rank or precedence. He knew the ship. He had worked directly under the holy men from the Foundation itself on repairing the ship. He had even been permitted to help, while the wise men of the Foundation had installed a device so holy it had never been placed in any previous ship, a hyperwave relay. It was no wonder he felt heartsick over the purposes to which the glorious ship was perverted. He had never wanted to believe what Verisov had told him, that its guns were to be turned on the great Foundation, that Foundation where he had been trained as a youth, from which all blessedness derived. Yet he could not doubt it now after what the Admiral had told him. How could the king, divinely blessed, allow this abominable act? Or was it the king? Was it not perhaps an action of the accursed regent Wiener? And it was Prince Levkin, the son of this same Wiener. That was the admiral who 5 minutes before had told him to attend to his souls and blessings, while he attended to the ship. Apparat smiled crookedly. He could attend to his souls and his blessings, and also to his cursings, and Prince Levkin would whine soon enough. He had entered the general communications room now. With quick, practiced motions, he moved the little levers that opened all communications, so that every part of the 2-mile-long ship was within reach of his voice and his image. "Soldiers of the royal flagship Wiener, attend. It is your priest attendant that speaks. Your ship is engaged in sacrilege. It is the intention of your commander to take this ship to the Foundation and there to bombard that source of all blessings into submission to his sinful will. and because this ship is upon such a devil's errand, the blessing of the Spirit is removed from it as well." He lifted his arms solemnly, and before 1,000 televisors throughout the ship, soldiers cowered as the stately image of their priest attendant spoke. "In the name of the Galactic Spirit, and of his prophet Harry Seldon, and of his interpreters, the holy men of the Foundation, I curse this ship." And with his last word, at the stroke of midnight, a hand light years distant in the Argolid temple opened a hyperwave relay, which at the instantaneous speed of the hyperwave opened another on the flagship Venus. And the ship died. For it is the chief characteristic of the religion of science that it works, and that such curses as that of Apparats are really deadly. Apparat saw the darkness close down the ship, and from the pocket of his long robe he withdrew a self-powered nucleo bulb that filled the room with a pearly light. As Apparat and his circle of light passed through the ship, soldiers crowded close, striving to touch the hem of his robe, pleading for the tiniest scrap of mercy, and always his answer was, "Follow me." He found Prince Lefkin groping his way through the officers' quarters, cursing loudly for lights. The admiral glared at the priest attendant and ordered him to return power to the ship. "I am commander here," he said. "No longer," answered a somber Apparat. Lefkin looked about wildly. He ordered his men to seize Apparat. "Seize the blasphemer," interrupted Apparat. "You listen to him at the peril of your souls." And promptly the noble admiral went down under the clutching hands of a score of soldiers. Apparat turned, and with Lefkin dragged along after him, and the corridors behind black with soldiery, he returned to the communications room. There he ordered the ex-commander before the one televisor that worked. Then he told him to order the rest of the fleet to cease course and to prepare for the return to Anacreon. The disheveled Lefkin, bleeding, beaten, and half-stunned, did so. "And now," continued Apparat, "we are in contact with Anacreon on the hyperwave beam. Speak as I order you. Begin." "The Anacreonian Navy." And Lefkin began. There was absolute silence in Wiena's chambers when the image of Prince Lefkin appeared on the televisor. Lefkin spoke reluctantly, as though he were being prompted, and not gently. He said that the Navy, aware of the nature of its mission, refused to be a party to such sacrilege and was returning to Anacreon. And he said that the one-time Prince Regent Venus was to be imprisoned and tried before an ecclesiastical court for his crimes. Otherwise, he concluded, the Royal Navy, upon returning to Anacreon, will blast the palace to the ground. Hardin's fingers passed rapidly over the nucleo bulb, and its light faded, and for the first time it could be seen that an aura encompassed Hardin, and he spoke. "The kings of the four kingdoms," he said, "accepted the religion of science that made them divine. But it was also their bridle and saddle, for it placed the lifeblood of nuclear power in the hands of the priesthood, who took their orders from us, be it noted, and not from you." Venus sprang to his feet, and in the shadows his eyes were maddened hollows. "Soldiers," he thundered, "shoot me down, that devil." Hardin turned about in his chair to face the soldiers and smiled. One aimed his nuclear blast and then lowered it. The others never budged. Salvor Hardin, mayor of Terminus, surrounded by that soft aura, smiling so confidently, and before whom all the power of Anacreon had crumbled to powder, was too much for them, despite the orders of the shrieking maniac just beyond. Venus wrested the nuclear blast from the nearest soldier's hand, aimed it at Hardin, who didn't stir, shoved the lever and held it contacted. Hardin still smiled. From his corner, Leopold covered his eyes and moaned. And with a yell of despair, Venus changed his aim and shot again, and toppled to the floor with his head blown into nothingness. Hardin winced at the sight and muttered, "A man of direct action to the end, the last refuge." The time vault was filled far beyond the available seating capacity, and men lined the back of the room 3 deep. Salvor Hardin compared this large company with a few men attending the first appearance of Harry Seldon 30 years earlier. It was quite different now, quite different in every respect. He himself was still mayor, but all-powerful now, and since the utter rout of Anacreon, all-popular. Across the room, Seth Cermak and a colleague were engaged in animated discussion. They had made speeches in which they publicly admitted they had been in the wrong, and immediately launched a new actionist campaign. The lights yellowed and went dim. Hardin straightened at the sight of the figure that now filled the glass cubicle that dominated the room, a figure in a wheelchair. The figure stared straight ahead, hands fingering a book in its lap. It said, "I am Harry Seldon." There was a breathless silence in the room, and Harry Seldon continued, "This is the second time I've been here. Of course, I don't know if any of you were here the first time. If you are not here, then the second crisis has been too much for you." He smiled engagingly. "I doubt that, however, for my figures show a 98.4% probability there is to be no significant deviation from the plan in the first 80 years. According to our calculations, you have now reached domination of the barbarian kingdoms immediately surrounding the Foundation. Just as in the first crisis you held them off by using the balance of power, so in the second you gained mastery by use of the spiritual power as against the temporal. However," he said, "I might warn you here against overconfidence. The Foundation is only at the start of the path that leads to the Second Galactic Empire. The neighboring kingdoms in manpower and resources are still overwhelmingly powerful. Outside them lies the vast tangled jungle of barbarism, and what is left of the Galactic Empire is still incomparably mighty." At this point, Harry Seldon lifted his book and opened it. His face grew solemn. "And never forget, there was another foundation established 80 years ago, a foundation at the other end of the galaxy at Star's End. They will always be there for consideration. Gentlemen, 920 years of the plan stretch ahead of you. The problem is yours." He dropped his eyes to his book and flicked out of existence. In the babble that followed, Johann Lee whispered to Hardin, "He didn't say when he'd be back." Hardin replied, "I know, but I trust he won't return until you and I are safely and cozily dead." The Traitors, from an entry in the Encyclopedia Galactica. And constantly in advance of the political hegemony of the Foundation were the traitors, reaching out tenuous fingerholds through the tremendous distances of the periphery. Months or years might pass between landings on Terminus. Their ships were often nothing more than patchwork quilts of homemade repairs and improvisations. Their honesty was none of the highest, their daring great. Through it all, they forged an empire more enduring than the pseudo-religious despotism of the Four Kingdoms. With psychohistoric inevitability, economic control of the Foundation grew. 75 years passed. The traders grew rich and became powerful merchant princes. It is sometimes forgotten that Hober Mallow began life as an ordinary trader. It is never forgotten that he ended it as the first of the merchant princes. Jorain Sutt, secretary to the mayor, put the tips of his carefully manicured fingers together. "It's something of a puzzle," he said. "In fact, and this is in the strictest of confidence, it may be another one of Harry Seldon's crises. We're facing nuclear weapons, and we don't know where they're coming from." Hober Mallow of Smyrna, master trader, smoked quietly, almost indifferently. Mallow never made the mistake of being over-polite to a Foundation man. Sut indicated the tri-dimensional star map on the table. He adjusted the controls, and the cluster of some half-dozen stellar systems blazed red. That, he said quietly, is the Corellian Republic. The trader nodded, saying he'd been there. Stinking rat hole, he commented. I suppose you can call it a republic, but it's always someone out of the Argo family that gets elected Commodore each time. And if you ever don't like it, things happen to you. He twisted his lips and repeated that he'd been there. But you've come back, said Sut, noting that 3 trade ships had disappeared within the territory of the Republic in the last year. Ships which had been armed with all the usual nuclear explosives and force field defenses. The question was, if Corel had nuclear weapons, where were they getting them from? Sut concluded that either the Corellians had constructed them themselves or, as he put it, we are being afflicted with a case of treason. Since the 4 kingdoms had accepted the Foundation Convention, he explained, they were dealing with considerable groups of dissident populations. He suggested that some were perhaps becoming active. Mallow was a dull red. Is there anything you want to say to me? I'm a Smyrnian, he said. Your sly little hints of treason aren't going to panic me into licking Foundation spittle. The secretary replied that Mallow had evidently missed the point. The fact that he was a Smyrnian meant he knew the Outlanders. You've been to Corel and you know the Corellians. That's where you've got to go. Mallow breathed deeply. As a spy, he asked. As a traitor, answered Sut, but with your eyes open. If you can find out where the power is coming from, I might remind you, since you're a Smyrnian, that 2 of those lost trade ships had Smyrnian crews. It was agreed that he would start in 6 days, at which time his ship would be ready. Mallow rose, shook hands roughly, and strode out. Sut waited, then shrugged his shoulders and stepped into the mayor's office. The mayor deadened the visiplate and asked the secretary what he made of it all. He could be a good actor, said Sut, and stared thoughtfully ahead. It was evening of the same day, and in Jorain Sut's bachelor apartment on the 21st floor of the Harden building, Publius Manlio was sipping wine slowly. In his slight, aging body were fulfilled 2 great offices of the Foundation. He was foreign secretary to the mayor's cabinet, and to all the outer sons, barring only the Foundation itself. He was, in addition, primate of the church, purveyor of the holy food, master of the temples, and so forth. Manlio was saying, but the mayor agreed to let you send out that traitor. It is a point. But such a small one, said Sut. It gets us nothing immediately. The whole business is the crudest sort of stratagem, since we have no way of foreseeing its end. Manlio agreed. This Mallow is a capable man, he remarked. What if he is not an easy prey to dupery? That was a chance, said Sut, that had to be run. If there is treachery, it is the capable men that are implicated. If not, we need a capable man to detect the truth. And Mallow will be guarded. I tell you, Manlio, we're in the middle of a Selden crisis. Manlio stared, then asked softly if Selden had appeared in the time vault again. That much, my friend, is not necessary, said Sut. Since the Galactic Empire abandoned the periphery and threw us out on our own, we have never had an opponent who possessed nuclear power. Now, for the first time, we have one. And for the first time in over 70 years, we are facing a major domestic political crisis. I should think, he concluded, the synchronization of the 2 crises, inner and outer, puts it beyond all doubt. Sut had a plan. Before we can meet the foreign threat of atomic power, he said, we have to put our own house in order. These traitors, they are useful, but they are too strong and too uncontrolled. They are outlanders, educated apart from the religion. Sut feared that under their secular leadership, the outer provinces, which had, since Hardin's time, looked to Terminus as the holy planet, might break away. A cure had to come quickly, before the Selden crisis became acute. Sut put down the empty glass he had been fingering. "This is obviously your job," he said to Manlio. "I can't do it. My office is appointive." And the mayor was entirely negative. But if an independent party arose that might endanger re-election, he could be led. Manlio was hesitant. He lacked, so he said, an aptitude for practical politics. "Leave that to me," said Sut. "Since Salvor Hardin's time, the primacy and mayoralty have never been combined in a single person. But it might happen now, if your job were well done." And in the other end of town, in homelier surroundings, Hober Mallow kept a second appointment. He had listened long, and now he said cautiously, "Yes, I've heard of your campaigns to get traders represented in the council. But why me, Twer?" James Twer, who would remind you any time, asked or unasked, that he was in the first group of outlanders to receive a lay education at the Foundation, beamed. "You've got glamour, or at any rate solid adventure publicity, which is the same thing. And now is our chance." According to Twer, the Actionist Party was splitting wide open and could be murdered right now on a straight question of equal rights for traders, or rather democracy, pro and anti. Mallow lounged back in his chair and stared at his thick fingers. "Sorry, Twer," he said. "I'm leaving next week on business. You'll have to get someone else." Twer stared. What kind of business, he wanted to know. "Very super secret," said Mallow. "AAA priority. Had a talk with the mayor's own secretary." James Twer grew excited. "Snake Sut? It's a trick. The son of a spacer is getting rid of you." Mallow's hand fell on the other's balled fist. "If it's a trick," he said, "I'll be back someday for the reckoning. If it isn't, your Snake Sut is playing into our hands. Listen, there's a Selden crisis coming up." Mallow waited for a reaction, but it never came. Twer merely stared. "What's a Selden crisis?" he asked. Mallow exploded angrily at the anticlimax. "What the blue blazes did you do when you were in school?" he said. "What do you mean anyway by a fool question like that?" The elder man frowned and asked that he explain. Mallow's eyebrows lowered, and he slowly explained the history of how Selden and his band of psychohistorians planted a colony, the Foundation, so, as he put it, that we could incubate art, science, and technology and form the nucleus of the Second Empire. The trader went on. He explained the tenets of psychohistory and the series of crises that would force them rapidly along the route to future empire. "We're approaching one now," he said, "our third." Twer shrugged and said he must have learned it in school, but had been out of school for a long time. "Forget it," replied Mallow. "What matters is that I'm being sent out in the middle of the development of the crisis. There's no telling what I'll find when I come back, and there's a council election every year." Quite suddenly, and matter of fact, Mallow asked Twer to come with him. "You were a trader before you decided there was more excitement in politics," he remarked. Twer hesitated. What if Sut wanted him where he could see him? "If he's anxious to get rid of me," observed Mallow, "why not you? Besides, there's no trader would hit space if he couldn't pick his own crew. I take whom I please." There was a queer glint in the older man's eyes as he agreed to go. Mallow grasped and shook the other's hand. "Good," he said. "All fired good. And now I've got to round up the boys. You know where the Far Star docks, don't you? Then show up tomorrow." Corel is that frequent phenomenon in history, the republic whose ruler has every attribute of the absolute monarch but the name. Materially, its prosperity was low. The day of the Galactic Empire had departed, and the day of the Foundation had not yet come. In the fierce determination of Corel's ruler, the Commodore Asper Argo, with his strict regulation of the traders and his stricter prohibition of missionaries, it was never coming. The spaceport itself was decrepit, and the crew of the Far Star were drearily aware of that. James Twere itched and fretted over a game of solitaire. Hober Mallow stared quietly out the viewport. The squadron of Corellian ships that had shot out to intercept the Far Star had been tiny, limping relics of ancient glory. They had maintained their distance fearfully for a week now. Mallow's requests for an audience with the local government had been unanswered. James Twere looked up impatiently and threw his cards aside. He was worried. Those ships might be waiting to blow them into the ground, or they might be waiting for reinforcements. Mallow had thought of that. However, he pointed out that since they'd gotten there without trouble, it could mean that the number of Corellian ships equipped with nuclear power was small, or that they hadn't nuclear power after all, or maybe had it and were keeping it under cover. It's one thing, he said, to piratize blundering, light-armed merchant ships. It's another to fool around with an accredited envoy of the Foundation when the mere fact of his presence may mean the Foundation is growing suspicious. He was interrupted by a crackling on the receiver. Mallow tuned it and looked up patiently. The visiplate glowed into the craggy face of the watch sergeant, announcing that the men had given entry to a Foundation missionary in need of hospitalization. Mallow ordered his men to battle stations. Crew's lounge was almost empty. 5 minutes after the order, even the men on the off shift were at their guns. Mallow entered slowly and stared the missionary up and down and around. His eyes slid to Lieutenant Tinter, who shifted uneasily to one side. Men filed in. Twere followed and closed the door silently. "Who let this man in without orders from me?" asked Mallow. The watch sergeant stepped forward. Every eye shifted. "Pardon, sir, it was no definite person. It was sort of a mutual agreement. He was one of us, you might say, and these foreigners—" Mallow cut him short. "When this is over," he said, "your men are to be confined to individual quarters for a week. You yourself are relieved of all supervisory duties for a similar period." The door closed behind the sergeant and the babble rose. Twere broke in. "Why the punishment, Mallow? You know that these Corellians kill captured missionaries." Mallow retorted that an action against his orders was bad in itself. "Bring the missionary," he demanded. "Get him here in front of me." The trader sat down while the scarlet-cloaked figure was carefully brought forward. "What's your name, Reverend?" "Eh?" The scarlet-robed figure wheeled towards Mallow, the whole body turning as a unit. His eyes were blankly open, and there was a bruise on one temple. "Your name, revered one." The missionary started to sudden, feverish life. His arms went out in an embracing gesture. "My son, my children, may you always be in the protecting arms of the galactic spirit." Twere stepped forward, eyes troubled. "The man's sick," he said. "Take him to bed, somebody. Order him to bed, Mallow, and have him seen to." Mallow's great arm shoved him back. "Your name, revered one," he asked again. The missionary's hands clasped in sudden supplication. "As you are enlightened men, save me from the heathen." The words tumbled out. "Save me from these brutes who would afflict the galactic spirit with their crimes. I am Jord Parma of the Anacreonian world. Educated at the Foundation, I am a priest of the spirit." A voice broke in on them as the emergency alarm clamored metallically. "Enemy units in sight. Instruction desired." Enemy units, several thousands of them in the persons of individuals of a Corellian mob. Mallow called for Tinter. He ordered him to get the outer speaker working and find out what they wanted. "Ask if they have a representative of the law with them," he said. "Make no promises and no threats, or I'll kill you." Tinter turned and left. Mallow felt a rough hand on his shoulder, and he struck it aside. It was Twere. His voice was an angry hiss in his ear. "Mallow, You're bound to hold on to this man. He's of the Foundation. And after all, he is a priest. These savages outside, do you hear me? I hear you, Twir. Mallow's voice was incisive. I've got more to do here than guard missionaries. I'll do what I please. And by Selden and all the galaxy, don't get in my way, Twir, or it will be the last of you. He turned and strode past. You, revered Parma, did you know that by convention, no Foundation missionaries may enter Corellian territory? The missionary was trembling. He said he could go but where the Spirit led him. If the darkened ones refuse enlightenment, he said, is it not the greater sign of their need for it? That's outside the question, said Mallow. You are here against the law of both Corel and the Foundation. I cannot protect you. The missionary's hands were raised again. There was the raucous clamor of the ship's outer communication system in action, and then Lieutenant Tinter was heard, saying that the mob was demanding George Palmer, and that they seemed quite mad. There is someone who says he governs the district and has police powers, said Tinter, but he is most evidently not his own master. Mallow shrugged. Tell them that if this governor or policeman or whatever he is approaches the ship alone, he can have the revered George Parma. And there was suddenly a gun in his hand. He added, I don't know what insubordination is, but if there's anyone here who thinks he can teach me, I'd like to teach him my antidote in return. The gun swiveled slowly and rested on Twir. Tinter left, and in 5 minutes a puny figure detached itself from the crowd. It approached slowly and hesitantly. All right, Mallow gestured with his hand blaster. Take him out. The missionary screeched. He raised his arms, and rigid fingers speared upward as the voluminous sleeves fell away to reveal the thin, veined arms. There was a momentary, tiny flash of light that came and went in a breath. Mallow blinked and gestured again contemptuously. The missionary's voice poured out as he struggled. Cursed be the traitor who abandons his fellow man to evil and to death. Twir clamped his hands tightly over his ears. Mallow flipped his blaster and put it away. He ordered the men to their stations and Twir to come with him. They were alone in Mallow's private quarters. Mallow indicated a chair, and Twir sat down. His stocky figure looked shrunken. Twir, he said, I'm disappointed. Your 3 years in politics seem to have gotten you out of traitor habits. I may be a Democrat back at the Foundation, but there's nothing short of tyranny that can run my ship the way I want it run. I never pulled a blaster, and wouldn't have had to now if you hadn't gotten out of line. The party leader apologized. He said that his motives were good, but that it was difficult to send a man out to be lynched. It's murder, he concluded. I can't help that, said Mallow. Frankly, the incident smelled bad. Didn't you notice? Notice what? Asked Twir. This spaceport is deep in the middle of a sleepy far section, said Mallow. Suddenly a missionary escapes. Where from? He comes here. Coincidence? A huge crowd gathers. From where? The nearest city of any size must be at least 100 miles away, but they arrive in half an hour. How? How? Echoed Twir. Mallow went on to suggest that the missionary had been brought there as bait, with a possible idea to have the traders go gallant in a stupid defense of the man. If I withhold him, it is an act of war against Corel, and the Foundation would have no legal right to defend us. Twir called that pretty far-fetched. The speaker blared. An official communication was delivered. It had been teleported direct from the capital on the Commodore's own stationery. Mallow read it and laughed. So my idea was far-fetched, was it? He tossed the communique to Twir. Half an hour after we hand back the missionary, we finally get a very polite invitation to the Commodore's august presence, after 7 days of previous waiting. Commodore Asper was a man of the people, by self-acclamation. His remaining back fringe of gray hair dropped limply to his shoulders, and his shirt needed laundering. "There is no ostentation here, Trader Mallow," he said. "No false show. In me you see merely the first citizen of the state. That's what Commodore means, and that's the only title I have. Perhaps I shouldn't say it, but I have been told that my people, my fellow citizens rather, know me as Asper, the well-beloved." Mallow commented that the despots and monarchs of surrounding worlds often lacked the qualities that would make a ruler well-beloved. "Up to now," he said, "trade between our two nations has suffered because of restrictions placed upon our traders by your government. Surely it has long been evident to you that unlimited trade would be of benefit to both of us." The Commodore emphasized that his people would not take commerce which carried with it a compulsory religion. Mallow seemed surprised. "So it has always been in effect," said the Commodore. He used the case of Ascone 20 years ago as an example. "First there was sold some of your goods, and then your people asked for complete freedom of missionary effort in order that the goods might be run properly. Ascone is now an integral member of the Foundation system, and the Grand Master cannot call his underwear his own." Mallow insisted that as a master trader, money was his religion. The Commodore laughed and said the Foundation should have sent a man of Mallow's caliber before this. He laid a friendly hand upon the trader's bulking shoulder. "But man," he said, "you have told me what the catch is not. Now tell me what it is." Mallow responded that the only catch was that the Commodore would be burdened with an immense quantity of riches. He drew gently out of an inner pocket a flat, linked chain of polished metal. "This, for instance," he said. He asked the puzzled Commodore if he could summon a woman, any young female, and a mirror, full length. At the Commodore's suggestion, they went to his dwelling place. A young girl was before them. The Commodore watched carefully while Mallow snapped the chain about the girl's waist and stepped back. "Will you draw the curtain, Commodore? Young lady, there's a little knob just near the snap. Will you move it upward, please? Go ahead, it won't hurt you." The girl did so, drew a sharp breath, looked at her hands, and gasped. From her waist as a source, she was drowned in a pale, streaming luminescence that drew itself over her head in a flashing coronet of liquid fire. Mallow handed her a necklace of dull pebbles, instructed her to put it around her neck. The girl did so, and each pebble, as it entered the luminescent field, became an individual flame that leaped and sparkled in crimson and gold. Mallow asked her what she thought of it. The girl didn't answer, but there was adoration in her eyes. The Commodore called it feminine frippery, and could not see where the money would come in. "You have dances, receptions, banquets," said Mallow. "Do you realize what women will pay for that sort of jewelry?" The Commodore plucked at his beard and seemed engaged in awesome mental calculations. "Galaxy, how they would fight for them! I'll keep the supply small and let them bid. Of course, it wouldn't do to let them know that I, personally—" Mallow interrupted, mentioning his complete line of household gadgets. Knives that don't require sharpening, the equivalent of a complete laundry that can be packed into a small closet, anything you like. It would, he pointed out, be worth many times the money to them, and they needn't know what the Commodore paid for it. And mind you, none of it would require priestly supervision. "Oh, and still another item at random. I could retool your factories," said Mallow. "Take your steel foundries. I have handy little gadgets that could do tricks with steel that would cut production costs to 1% of previous marks. Do you have a steel foundry in this city? It wouldn't take long." The Commodore commented that it could be arranged, but stressed that this was not an entering wedge for missionaries. "Commodore," said Mallow, "I give you my word that religion would cut my profits." The foundry was large and bore the odor of decay which no amount of superficial repairs could quite erase. It was in an unnatural state of quiet now, as it played unaccustomed host to the Commodore and his court. Mallow had swung a steel sheet onto two supports. He had taken the instrument held out to him by Twir and was gripping the leather handle encased within a leaden sheath. Then he drew the instrument swiftly down the length of the steel sheet, which quietly and instantly fell in two. The court jumped, and Mallow laughed. He picked up one of the halves and propped it against his knee. "You can adjust the cutting length accurately," he explained, "to 1/100th of an inch, and the 2-inch sheet will slit down the middle as easily as this thing did." They were crowded around now. Commodore Asper fingered scraps of steel. High officials of the government watched over each other's shoulders and whispered, while Mallow punched clean, beautiful round holes through an inch of hard steel at every touch of his nuclear drill. Then Mallow looked up at his audience, stumbled at his first word, and stopped. There was the keen stirring of excitement in his chest, and the base of his stomach went tingling and cold. The Commodore's own bodyguard, in the confusion, had struggled to the front line, and Mallow, for the first time, was near enough to see their unfamiliar hand weapons in detail. They were nuclear. There was no mistaking it. An explosive projectile weapon with a barrel like that was impossible. But that wasn't the big point. That wasn't the point at all. The butt of those weapons had, deeply etched upon them, in worn gold plating, the spaceship and sun. The same spaceship and sun that was stamped on every one of the great volumes of the original encyclopedia that the Foundation had begun and had not yet finished. The same spaceship and sun that had blazoned the banner of the Galactic Empire through millennia. The Empire. A century and a half had passed, but there was still the Empire, somewhere deeper in the galaxy, and it was emerging again, out into the periphery. Mallow smiled. The Far Star was 2 days out in space when Hober Mallow, in his private quarters with Senior Lieutenant Draught, handed him an envelope, a roll of microfilm, and a silvery spheroid. "As of an hour from now," he said to the lieutenant, "you're acting captain of the Far Star, until I return, or forever." Mallow explained that the envelope contained the exact location of the planet where the lieutenant was to proceed and wait for 2 months, at which time, if the Foundation located him, the microfilm was Mallow's report of the trip. "If I do not return at the end of 2 months, and Foundation vessels do not locate you, proceed to the planet Terminus and hand in the time capsule as the report." The interview ended, and 50 minutes later, a lifeboat kicked lightly off the side of the Far Star. Onum Bar was an old man, too old to be afraid. Since the last disturbances, he had lived alone on the fringes of the land. He had nothing he feared losing, and so he faced the intruder without cringing. "Your door was open," the stranger explained. Bar did not fail to notice the strange blue steel hand weapon at his hip. In the half-gloom of the small room, Bar saw the glow of a force shield surrounding the man. The stranger introduced himself as Hober Mallow. He came, he said, from a far province. Bar nodded and smiled. He was Onum Bar of Siwenna, and once patrician of the Empire. "Then this is Siwenna," said Mallow, explaining that he had only old maps to guide him. All he needed were directions to the center of government. Bar informed him that it was on Orsha 2. "Your map will direct you," he said. "How old is it?" Mallow told him it was 150 years old. Bar sighed. "That old," he said. "History has been crowded since. It has been an evil time for the provinces, but for the reign of Stanel VI, and he died 50 years ago. Since that time, nothing but ruin, ruin and rebellion." Mallow said with sudden sharpness that it sounded as if the province were impoverished. The old man asked why he was so interested in all this. "You are all alive, and your eyes shine," he said. The trader came near enough to blushing as the faded eyes seemed to look too deeply into his and smile at what they saw. "Now look here," said Mallow. "I'm a trader out toward the rim of the galaxy. I've located some old maps, and I'm out to open new markets. Naturally, talk of impoverished provinces disturbs me." The old man leaned forward. "You a trader?" he said. "You look more like a fighter. You hold your hand on your gun." Mallow jerked his head. "There isn't much law where I come from," he said. "Fighting is part of a trader's overhead." "Listen," said the old man. "I knew you when you entered. You had a force shield about your body, or had when I first saw you." Barr stopped suddenly. "What do you say?" And those sharp old eyes peered deep. The trader considered. "I say nothing, but I'd like to ask something. I know that Siwenna possesses knowledge of nucleics. Do they have power generators?" Almost proudly the old man told that they were the largest and best on this side of Trantor itself. Mallow wanted to know how he could go about seeing one of these generators. Barr informed him that the generators were controlled by a specialized group called the Techmen, and only they could enter a station. "I don't say, though," Barr added, "that there aren't cases where Techmen haven't been bribed. I suppose even a Techman can fall prey to money." Said Mallow, "One does not always bribe with money." Then he asked for directions to the nearest city with one of the stations. Within 5 minutes he was gone. The Techman was short, and his skin glistened with well-kept plumpness. His hair was a fringe, and his skull shone through pinkly. The rings on his fingers were thick and heavy, and he was the first man Mallow had met on the planet who hadn't looked hungry. He seemed to evaluate Mallow's definitely un-Siwanese costume, and his eyelids were heavy with suspicion. "I am not of the neighborhood," said Mallow calmly, "but the matter is irrelevant. I have had the honor of sending you a little gift yesterday." The Techman's nose lifted. He had received it and termed it an interesting gewgaw that he might have use for on occasion. "I have other and more interesting gifts," said the trader, quite out of the gewgaw stage. The Techman replied that he already saw the course of the interview. "You wish to be adopted into our clan," he said. "You wish to be taught the mysteries of nucleics." Mallow would have spoken, but the Techman, roaring, threatened to report him to the protector of the city if he did not leave. Mallow smiled to himself. The entire speech was patently artificial in tone and content. Mallow rose and pushed the chair aside. "I have waited 3 days to see you, Your Wisdom, but the display will take only 3 seconds. If you will draw that blaster whose butt I see very near your hand and shoot me, I will be obliged." The Techman gasped in disbelief. "If I am killed," said Mallow, "you can tell the police I tried to bribe you into betraying guild secrets. If I am not killed, you may have my shield." For the first time, the Techman became aware of the dimly lit white illumination that hovered closely about his visitor, as though he had been dipped in pearl dust. His blaster raised to the level, and with eyes asquint in wonder and suspicion, he closed contact. The molecules of air, caught in the sudden surge of atomic disruption, tore into glowing, burning ions and marked out the blinding thin line that struck at Mallow's heart and splashed. While Mallow's look of patience never changed, the nuclear forces that tore at him consumed themselves against that fragile pearly illumination and crashed back to die in midair. The Techman's blaster dropped to the floor with an unnoticed crash. Mallow asked if the Emperor had a personal force shield. Then he added, "You can have one. Do you want it?" A thin knobbed chain fell upon the desk. "There it is." The Techman snatched it up and fingered it nervously. "Where's the power?" he asked. Mallow's finger fell upon the largest knob, dull in its leaden case. The Techman looked up, and his face was congested with blood. "Sir, I am a Techman, senior grade," he said. "I have studied under the great Blair at the University of Trantor. If you have the infernal charlatanry to tell me that a small container the size of a walnut, blasted, holds a nuclear generator, I'll have you before the protector in 3 seconds. Explain it yourself, then, if you can, said Mallow. I say it's complete. The tech man's flush faded slowly as he bound the chain about his waist and, following Mallow's gesture, pushed the knob. The radiance that surrounded him shone in dim relief. And then, convulsively, he closed circuit, and the nuclear fire dashed against his hand harmlessly. He whirled. And what if I shoot you now and keep the shield? Try, said Mallow. Do you think I gave you my only sample? And he, too, was solidly encased in light. The tech man giggled nervously, asking what was wished in return. I want to see your generators, said Mallow. The tech man told him that this was forbidden and could mean ejection into space for both of them. I don't want to touch them or have anything to do with them, said Mallow. I want to see them from a distance. If not, he added, you have your shield, but I have other things. For one thing, a blaster especially designed to pierce that shield. The tech man's home was a small 2-story affair on the outskirts of the huge cubiform that dominated the center of the city. Mallow and his guide passed into the cubiform through an underground passage and found themselves in the silent, ozone-tinged atmosphere of the powerhouse. For 15 minutes, Mallow followed his guide and said nothing. His eyes missed nothing, his fingers touched nothing. Back in the office, Mallow asked the tech man if all those generators were in his hands. Every one, was his complacent answer. All right, said Mallow. Suppose I were to blast a vital part into nothingness. Could you repair it? The tech man, howling, said that Mallow had gotten more than he asked for and ordered him to get out. Mallow bowed with satiric respect and left. 2 days later, he was back where the Far Star waited to return with him to the planet Terminus. And 2 days later, the tech man's shield went dead, and for all his puzzling and cursing, never glowed again. Mallow relaxed for almost the first time in 6 months. He was on his back in the sunroom of his new house, stripped to the skin. The man beside him placed the cigar between Mallow's teeth and lit it. He champed on one of his own and said, You must be overworked. Maybe you need a long rest. The trader said that he would rather rest in a council seat, because, he added, I'm going to have that seat and you're going to help me. Angkor Jail raised his eyebrows. How, he wanted to know, had he gotten into this? You got in, obviously, said Mallow. Firstly, you're an old dog of a politico. Secondly, you were booted out of your cabinet seat by Geraint Sutt, the same fellow who'd rather lose an eyeball than see me in the council. There was a sound at the door. Geraint Sutt himself, said Mallow. He's early. Look, Jail, get into the next room and turn the speaker on low. I want you to listen. He helped the council member out of the room with a shove of his bare foot, then scrambled up and into a silk robe. The synthetic sunlight faded to normal power. The secretary of the mayor entered stiffly. Mallow fastened his belt and said, Take your choice of chairs, Sutt. Sutt barely cracked a flickering smile. The chair he chose was comfortable, but he did not relax into it. From its edge, he said, If you'll state your terms to begin with, we'll get down to business. Mallow wanted to know what he meant. You wish to be coaxed, said Sutt. Well then, what, for instance, did you do at Corel? Your report was incomplete. Since then, your activities have been significant. We know, he said, exactly how many factories you're putting up and how much it's costing you. And there's this palace you have. Sutt continued. It all showed money that Mallow didn't have a year ago. And that could show that a good deal went on at Corel that was unreported. Where are you getting your money, he asked. The trader answered that it came straight from the treasure chests of the Commodore of Corel. Sutt blinked. Mallow smiled and continued. Unfortunately for you, he said, the money is quite legitimate. I was sent, to quote yourself, to keep my eyes open. They were never shut. Mallow explained that he had followed orders, but beyond that, he said, I was, and still am, a free agent. What are your objections? Sut bent his eyes carefully toward the wall and spoke with a difficult lack of anger. It is the general custom of all traders to advance the religion with their trade, he said. I adhere to law, not custom, said Mallow. There are times when custom can be the higher law, answered the other. Then appeal to the courts, said Mallow. Sut raised somber eyes. You're a Smyrnian after all. Listen and try to understand just the same. This goes beyond money or markets, he began. We have the science of the great Harry Seldon to prove that upon us depends the future empire of the galaxy, and from that course we cannot turn. Religion is an all-important instrument towards that end. The primary reason for the development of trade and traders, he said, was to introduce this religion more quickly. And your attempt at trade for its own sake, at the subversion of interstellar policy to the god of profits, at the divorce of nuclear power from our controlling religion, can only end with the overthrow and complete negation of the policy that has worked successfully for a century. And time enough, too, said Mallow, for a policy that is dated, dangerous, and impossible. Since the case of Ascone 2 decades back, there isn't a ruler in the periphery now that wouldn't sooner cut his own throat than let a priest of the Foundation enter the territory. I don't propose to force Corel or any other world to accept something it doesn't want. If nuclear power makes them dangerous, a sincere friendship through trade will be many times better than an insecure overlordship based on the hated supremacy of a foreign spiritual power. Very nicely put, said Sut. So, to get back to the original point of the discussion, what are your terms? What are you required to exchange your ideas for mine? Mallow replied, Can you offer me more than I'm getting as is? You could have 3/4 of your trade profits rather than half. Mallow laughed shortly. You'll have to try harder than that. With a sudden movement, Sut clenched his fist. How about a trial for murder, he said. The murder of an Anacreonian priest in the service of the Foundation. Sut leaned forward. He insisted he was not bluffing. I have only to sign one final paper, he said, and the case of the Foundation versus Hober Mallow, master trader, is begun. You abandoned the subject of the Foundation to torture and death at the hands of an alien mob. For myself, I'd rather you decided to bluff your way through a trial. You'd be safer as a destroyed enemy than as a doubtfully converted friend. Mallow said, You have your wish. The secretary smiled savagely. The door opened before him, and he left. Mallow looked up as Anchor Jail re-entered the room. He asked the politician what he made of it. It's my notion, said Jail, that his ultimate aims aren't spiritual. He's not stupid. He must see the bankruptcy of our religious policy, which has hardly made a single conquest for us in 70 years. He's obviously using it for purposes of his own. Mallow asked Jail to elaborate. Well, said Jail, suppose one man, one ambitious man, uses the force of religion against us rather than for us. He could mobilize the various hierarchies on the subject planets against the Foundation in the name of orthodoxy. And what chance would we have? He could make a war on heresy as represented by you, for instance, and make himself king eventually. After all, it was Salvor Hardin who said, a nuclear blaster is a good weapon, but it can point both ways. Mallow slapped his bare thigh. All right, Jail, he said, get me in that council, and I'll fight him. Jail paused and then asked if the business about having a priest lynched was true. Mallow answered that it was, and Jail asked if Sut had definite proof. He should have. Mallow hesitated, then added, James Twir was his man from the beginning, though neither of them knew that I knew that, and Twir was an eyewitness. Jail shook his head. That's bad, he said. Sut plays dirty, and you heard what he said. Custom is higher than law at times. You could walk out of the trial scot-free, but if the people think you threw a priest to the dogs, your popularity is gone. You might even lose your rating as master trader by having your citizenship voted away from you. What more do you think Sut can want? Mallow frowned stubbornly. My boy, said Jael, I'll stand by you, but I can't help. You're on the spot. Dead center. The council chamber was full in a very literal sense on the fourth day of the trial of Hober Mallow, master trader. The galleries were filled to the aisleways and the ceilings with those who managed to get in. The rest filled the square outside in swarming knots about the open-air trimensional visors. Anchor Jael made his way into the chamber with the near-futile aid of the police department, and through the confusion within to Hober Mallow's seat. Mallow turned with relief. How are they taking it outside, he asked. They're wild clear through. Jael stirred uneasily. You should never have allowed public hearings. You could have stopped them. Mallow answered that he didn't want to. There's lynch talk, said Jael, and Publius Manlio's men on the outer planets are stirring up the hierarchy against you. The mayor was taking his seat now, and the council members were rising in respect. Mallow whispered, It's my turn today. Sit here and watch the fun. 15 minutes later, Hober Mallow stepped through a hostile whisper to the empty space before the mayor's bench. He began easily and quietly. To save time, I will admit the truth of every point made against me by the prosecution. The story of the priest and the move as related by them is perfectly accurate in every detail. There was a stirring in the chamber and a triumphant mass snarl from the gallery. He waited patiently for silence. However, he continued, the picture they presented fell short of completion. I ask the privilege of supplying the completion in my own fashion. Mallow made no reference to the notes before him. I begin, he said, at the same time as the prosecution did, the day of my meeting with Geraint Sut and James Twere. Two people, neither of whom I knew more than casually, make unnatural and unbelievable propositions to me. One, the secretary to the mayor, asks me to play the part of intelligence agent to the government. The other, self-styled leader of a political party, asks me to run for a council seat. Naturally, I looked for an ulterior motive. Sut's seemed evident. He didn't trust me. He would need a man of his own near me on my proposed mission as a spy. The last thought, however, did not occur to me until James Twere came on the scene. Consider again, Mallow went on. Twere presents himself as a trader, retired into politics, yet I know no details of his trading career. And further, though Twere boasted of a lay education, he had never heard of a Selden crisis. Hober Mallow waited to let the significance sink in, and was rewarded with the first silence he had yet encountered. Mallow continued, I knew at that instant that James Twere had never been a traitor. I knew then that he was in holy orders, and perhaps a full-fledged priest. He had been a bought man of Geraint Sut. That, said Mallow, explains a certain action of mine on the occasion of the first appearance of the priest whom I am accused of having murdered, an action yet unknown to you. Now there was a disturbed whispering in the courtroom. Mallow cleared his throat theatrically and continued. He described his feelings upon hearing that they had a refugee missionary aboard as consisting of wild uncertainty. The event struck me as a move by Sut, he said. There was one thing I could do. I got rid of Twere for 5 minutes by sending him after my officers. In his absence, I set up a visual record receiver. I have the visual record with me right now, and I'm going to show it in your presence. The mayor pounded monotonously for order as the chamber lost its equilibrium and the crowd roared. At the prosecutor's bench, Geraint Sut shook his head coldly at the nervous high priest, while his eyes blazed fixedly on Mallow's face. The center of the chamber was cleared, and the lights burnt low. Anchor Jail from his bench on the left made adjustments, and with a preliminary click, a holographic scene sprang to view, in color, in 3 dimensions. There was the missionary, confused and battered, standing between the lieutenant and the sergeant. Mallow's image waited silently. The men filed in, Twir bringing up the rear. The conversation played itself out, word for word. The sergeant was disciplined, and the Reverend George Palmer made his wild appeal. Mallow drew his gun, and the missionary, as he was dragged away, lifted his arms in a mad final curse, and a tiny flash of light came and went. The scene ended. The lights were on again. Mallow, the real Mallow of the present, took up the burden of his narration. This incident, you see, is exactly as the prosecution has presented it. The prosecution has expected me to explain that the safety of my ship, my crew, my mission itself were at stake and could not be sacrificed for one man, when that man would, in any case, have been destroyed, with or without us. For some strange reason, however, the prosecution has neglected George Palmer himself. The prosecution has advanced no details concerning George Palmer because it cannot. That scene you saw by visual record seemed phony because George Palmer was phony. This whole trial is the biggest farce ever cooked up over an issue that never existed. Once more, Mallow had to wait for the babble to die down. Then he proceeded to show an enlargement of a single still from the visual record. The chamber dimmed, and the empty air filled again with frozen figures and ghostly, waxen illusion. The officers of the Far Star struck their stiff, impossible attitudes. A gun pointed from Mallow's rigid hand. At his left, the revered George Palmer, caught in mid-shriek, stretched his claws upward, while the falling sleeves hung halfway. And from the missionary's hand, there was that little gleam that in the previous showing had flashed and gone. It was a permanent glow now. "Keep your eye on that light on his hand," called Mallow from the shadows. "Enlarge that scene, Jail." The tableau bloated quickly. Now there was only a hand and an arm, and then only a hand, which filled everything. The light had become a set of fuzzy, flowing letters, KSP. "That," said Mallow, "is a sample of tattooing, gentlemen. Under ordinary light, it is invisible. But under ultraviolet light, with which I flooded the room in taking this visual record, it stands out in high relief. Perhaps some of you have already guessed what KSP stands for. George Palmer knew his priestly lingo and did his job magnificently. Where he had learned it and how, I cannot say. But KSP stands for Karelian State Police." Roaring against the tumult, Mallow asked where the prosecution's case was now. "They have made and remade the suggestion that I should have fought for the missionary, sacrificed all for the honor of the foundation. But to do it for an impostor? Should I have done it then for a Karelian secret agent, tricked out in the robes and verbal gymnastics probably borrowed of an Anacreonian exile? Would Geraint Sutt and Publius Manlio have had me fall into a stupid, odious trap?" His voice faded into the featureless background of a shouting mob. He was being lifted onto shoulders and carried to the mayor's bench. Slowly he became aware of a rhythmic, repeated shout that was pulsing into insanity. "Long live Mallow! Long live Mallow! Long live Mallow!" Anchor Jail blinked at Mallow out of a haggard face. The last 2 days had been mad, sleepless ones. He warned the traitor that mob enthusiasm was a powerful thing, but notoriously fickle. "Exactly," replied Mallow. "So we must coddle it, and the best way is to continue the show. You're to have the mayor arrest Geraint Sutt and Publius Manlio." An incredulous Jail wanted to know on what charges. On the obvious one, answered the traitor. They've been inciting the priesthood of the outer planets to take sides in the factional quarrels of the Foundation. Mallow didn't care about the conviction. He just wanted them out of circulation until he was mayor. Listen, he said, I'd seize the government by force if I had to, the way Salvor Hardin did 100 years ago. There's still that Selden crisis coming up, and when it comes, I have to be mayor and high priest, both. Jael's brow furrowed. Was it to be war with Corel after all? Mallow nodded. They would definitely declare war, although he bet it would take another pair of years. They were, he was sure, getting nuclear ships from the Empire itself. It's still there, he told Jael. It may be gone here in the periphery, but in the galactic center, the Empire is still very much alive. One false move means that it itself may be on our neck. That's why I must be mayor and high priest. I'm the only man who knows how to fight the crisis. Jael swallowed dryly. Mallow went on. When I'm boss of this foundation, he said, I'm going to do nothing. That is the secret of this crisis. Hober Mallow shuffled his feet wearily as he leafed through the reports. 2 years of the mayoralty and war between the Foundation and Corel had made him a bit softer, but it had not made him learn to like government reports. How many ships did they get? He asked Jael. The answer was 4 trapped on the ground, 2 unreported, all others accounted for and safe. Jael, now Minister of Education and Propaganda, went on to complain. For the last year he had cautioned Mallow of the rising danger of Sut and his religionists, who could force an election and have the mayor thrown out. Mallow, wake up, he said. You have 2 alternatives. Either you present the people with a dynamic foreign policy, whatever your private plans, or you make some sort of compromise with Sut. Just then Sut arrived and took his seat without shaking hands. Mallow offered a cigar. Sut shrugged. Upon another occasion, I once asked you to state your terms, he said. I presume the positions are reversed now. His terms were succinct. Mallow was to abandon his blundering policy of economic bribery and trade in gadgetry, and return to the tested foreign policy of conquest by missionary. Mallow lit up slowly and inhaled the tip of his cigar into a bright glow. Tell me, he asked, how would you get out of our present mess? Sut replied that a strong offensive was indicated. The stalemate you seem satisfied with is fatal, he said. And if you beat Corel, said Mallow, what of the Empire? That is the real enemy. He went on, we are facing a Selden crisis, and Selden crises are not solved by brilliant heroics, but by the broad sweeps of economics and sociology. So the solutions of the various crises must be achieved by the forces that become available to us at the time. In this case, trade. Sut raised his eyebrows skeptically. Mallow went on, Corel is now at war with us, so trade between us has stopped. But in the past 3 years, Corel has based her economy more and more upon the nuclear techniques which we have introduced, and only we can continue to supply. What would happen, he asked, once the tiny nuclear generators begin to fail, and one gadget after another goes out of commission? Sut said slowly, wonderingly, is that what you're setting your hopes on, man? What do you expect? A sudden uprising of butchers and grocers with their cleavers and bread knives shouting, give us back our automatic super-clino-nuclear washing machines? Impatiently, Mallow explained, the industries of Corel, which we have changed from first to last with new nuclear gadgets, will find themselves suddenly ruined. How long, he asked, will the Commodore hold out? Sut answered, until it occurs to him to get new nuclear generators from the Empire. And Mallow laughed joyously. You've missed, Sut, he said. Missed as badly as the Commodore himself. Look, man, the Empire can replace nothing. Their generators are gigantic. But we, our little foundation, our single world without metallic resources, have had to work with brute economy, had to develop new techniques and new methods. The whole war is a battle between those two systems, between the big and the little. They bribe with immense ships that can make war, but we bribe with little things, useless in war, but vital to prosperity and profits. And Asperargo won't stand up against the economic depression that will sweep all Corel in 2 or 3 years. Sut was at the window, his back to Mallow in jail. It was early evening now, and the few stars that struggled feebly here at the rim of the galaxy sparked against the background of the misty, wispy lens that included the remnants of the Empire, still vast, that fought against them. Sut said, "No, you are not the man. You befooled me when I thought I had you under proper care on your first trip to Corel. There is nothing straight about you, no motive that hasn't another behind it, no statement that hasn't 3 meanings. Suppose you were a traitor. Suppose your visit to the Empire had brought you a subsidy and a promise of power. Your actions would be precisely what they are now." "You mean there'll be no compromise?" Mallow asked. Jorain Sut's face congested with blood in a sudden access of emotion. "I mean you must get out," he said, "by free will or force. And I warn you, Hober Mallow of Smyrno, that if you arrest me, my men will stop nowhere in spreading the truth about you. They have a consciousness of destiny that a Smyrnian can never understand, and that consciousness will destroy you." Hober Mallow quietly instructed the 2 guards who had entered to arrest Sut and take him away. Mallow stubbed out his cigar and never looked up. 5 minutes later, Jael stirred and said to Mallow, "You're too sure of yourself. You're ignoring the possibility of a popular rebellion." "I am sure of the Selden crisis," said Mallow, "and of the historical validity of their solutions. Sut tried to control the Foundation by religious forces, and he failed, which is the surest sign that in the Selden scheme, religion is played out." Mallow explained that economic control worked differently. If Corel prospered with our trade, he said, so did we. And if the prosperity of the outer worlds vanishes with commercial isolation, so will our factories fail and our prosperity vanish. And there isn't a factory, not a trading center, not a shipping line that isn't under my control. "So then," said Jael, "you're establishing a plutocracy. You're making us a land of traders and merchant princes. But what of the future?" Mallow lifted his gloomy face and exclaimed fiercely, "What business of mine is the future? No doubt Selden has foreseen it and prepared against it. There will be other crises in the time to come, when money power has become as dead a force as religion is now. Let my successor solve those new problems, as I have solved the one of today." From the Encyclopedia Galactica. And so, after 3 years of war, which was certainly the most unfought war on record, the Republic of Corel surrendered unconditionally, and Hober Mallow took his place next to Harry Selden and Salvor Hardin in the hearts of the people of the Foundation. We hope you've enjoyed listening to Foundation. This is Isaac Asimov. Foundation was produced by David Rapkin and directed by Charles Potter. Copyright 1988, Bantam Audio Publishing. All rights reserved.